Instead of watching yet another terrible Halloween sequel, I've spent this month immersed in some of the best Japanese horror films of the 1960s. I'm talking about cinematic masterpieces like Onibaba, Kwaidan, and the great Kuroneko, all of which I would describe as classic Japanese tales of horror. You know what else could be described that way? Musya. I mean, it's right there in the title. Musya, the classic Japanese tale of horror. With a name like that, I had to see if this 1992 action game on the Super NES was as scary as it sounded. Turn back now if you don't want to know what happens next, because today we're going to spoil the story and ending for Musya, the classic Japanese tale of horror. This is Game Over, the early years. This is the tale of Emoto, a lucky pikeman who managed to be the sole survivor of the Great Battle by fleeing to a nearby mountain village. And when I say that he fled, what I really mean is that he got a few steps towards the village before falling to the ground and passing out. When he awoke, Emoto was greeted by Akagi, who explains that he is in Tangumura, the gatekeepers of the Abyss. Why that matters is because Shizuka, the woman who holds the talisman that seals the Abyss, was abducted by the Evil One, who's desperately trying to get out of the Abyss. Hearing this, Emoto is convinced that fate actually spared him from death in the Great Battle so that he could fight through the Abyss and save the maiden Shizuka. Alright, so for a game that says the classic Japanese tale of horror right on the cover, I'm not sure I would call this game scary. Yes, it contains a bunch of creepy crawly demon monsters who want to stop you from saving Shizuka, but the frights aren't even up to the super ghouls and ghosts standard, which was already pretty tame. Considering how terrifying some of those classic Japanese horror movies were, this is honestly disappointing. I'm not sure I would call it a classic, and the story can barely be described as a tale, and it's definitely not horrifying. But I suppose they were accurate when they called it Japanese, so 1 out of 4 ain't bad. Anyway, Emoto's journey towards the Abyss is about as straightforward as it can be. Emoto finds the Tangumura caverns and catacombs in order to locate the Palace of Hate, which is home to this mud monster who tries to trap our hero in a pool of waist-high muck. Hey, you know who else is at the Palace of Hate? That's right, it's Shizuka, who was apparently turned into a statue by her abductors. Obviously, she's incredibly grateful to be free, but warns our hero that the talisman that unlocks the gate has been stolen by Gobo and taken to his master. Yeah, that's bad news, but don't feel bad, Emoto, because Shizuka magically imbues the spear with the power of the ancients. That comes in handy because we're off to the Cave of Darkness, where we find the game's iconic waterfall sequence, complete with flying heads, massive eyeballs, and other ghoulish creatures. This eventually leads to the Catacomb of Akuma, but don't get too excited, it's not that Akuma. Instead, what you do is you fight this slow-moving puddle monster, which you should definitely not call the Blob. That, you see, would be a classic American tale of horror. The Cursed Palace certainly has an ominous name, but it also uses a lot of the same sprites we saw back at the Palace of Hate. That said, it does have one of the coolest bosses in this entire game, which is this massive samurai statue that comes to life and seems to have a demonic face on his chest plate. He's genuinely the most intimidating part of this entire game. Alright, so that samurai was basically the last thing standing in the way of Emoto infiltrating the watery prison, which is where the Evil One is being kept. Apparently, he's the one holding onto the talisman, so Emoto rushes through one of the coolest looking parts of this entire game. It has this water section, a platforming bit where you jump on a bunch of giant spikes, and then a cave that is completely engulfed in flames. It's here where our hero discovers a locked gate that blows open to reveal a massive flying face. When you smack it enough time, that face suddenly becomes a flying ball of energy, which I gotta admit isn't nearly as cool looking. All it takes is a few more smacks to defeat the monster, and this is what happens next. Look, this ending's fine. I mean, it's nothing special, and if I'm being honest, I think the fight with the flying head is probably more interesting than the actual payoff. You can tell that time and attention went into making that boss look as big and creepy as possible. And you know what? I think they did a good job. But the actual ending cinema? Yeah, it's pretty standard stuff. The pikeman wants to keep fighting, and the maiden wants him to stay, and the rest is left to myth and legend, I guess. Not exactly riveting stuff here, but hey, at least that song is a banger. You know what, though? I think the reason that I'm down on this ending is because the subtitle sets up an unrealistic expectation for Musya. Obviously, it's probably asking too much for a side-scrolling action game to be scary. But saying that this is the classic Japanese tale of horror honestly feels like false advertising. It's not frightful or terrifying, and certainly not the kind of horror game that I would normally put on for Halloween. The Japanese version calls it Japan-esque horror action, which is a little bit more accurate. As clumsy as that subtitle is, I definitely would have gone in with a different expectation if that was on the box. But would that have made me like this ending more? Nah, probably not. There just isn't enough to this classic Japanese tale of horror. Watch Kwaidan instead, it's just so much better. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Game Over, the early years. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes almost every week. In fact, we're going to post one more horror-themed episode on Halloween, and it's a big one. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is the scariest side-scrolling video game you've ever played? I mean, I'm talking about older games, but look, you can cheat and come up with something new if you really want to. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back next week with reviews of 2 recently released Cotton games, plus just a whole lot more. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.